Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're going to be looking into the disturbing case of Daniel Lee Corwin.
Yeah.
You sent us his Wikipedia page, and
I
I gotta say, this is one of those stories that really grabs you right from the start.
It's a wild one.
Corwin's life, it's like a really dark warning
Yeah.
about what can happen when a repeat offender just keeps going down that wrong path.
Yeah, even after they face consequences,
Exactly.
it really gets you thinking about these patterns we see with criminal behavior.
Yeah.
Like, why do some people,
Yeah.
even after they've been punished,
Right.
they still can't seem to break free from that cycle of violence?
Right. In this case, it's almost like...
It's fascinating.
It is.
It's fascinating.
It's like a window into the world of criminal psychology.
Absolutely.
And all the challenges that come with, trying to rehabilitate someone.
Totally.
So let's start with the basic.
Yeah, let's set the stage.
Corwin, he was born in California in 1958.
Okay.
And get this, his first really awful crime. It happened when he was only 16.
16 years old.
16 years old.
That's right. In 1975, he targeted a classmate right there in the high school parking lot, forced her into her own car
Wow.
with a knife, drove her to a secluded area, raped her.
Oh my gosh.
And then it just gets even more brutal from there.
Unbelievable.
He dragged her out, slit her throat,
Oh my God.
stabbed her multiple times, and left her in a dirt pit thinking she was dead.
I mean, just trying to imagine what that poor girl went through.
It's horrifying.
The level of violence, and at that age, I mean...
Really is.
It's just bone-chilling.
It's incredibly disturbing.
And what's even more disturbing,
Yeah.
this wasn't just like a one-time impulsive act.
Exactly. The severity of this first attack.
Right.
It really makes you think, were there already some deep-rooted issues going on here?
I mean, was he...
He got a 40-year sentence for kidnapping, rape, attempted murder.
Right.
But the question is, was he really rehabilitated during that time?
Because he was released after only 9 years, right?
Only 9 years?
Which, I mean, given what he did...
It doesn't seem like nearly enough time.
No, it doesn't.
No, it really raises some questions about, was public safety really the priority back then?
Right.
Was the justice system even equipped to handle someone like Corwin?
Yeah.
Was enough being done to address those underlying psychological factors
Right.
that we were just talking about?
Right.
These are questions that, still kind of haunt us today.
They do, and the consequences of that early release...
They were devastating.
They were devastating in 1987. Corwin, he went on this terrifying crime spree in Texas.
Yeah.
And this time it escalated beyond attempted murder.
This time his crimes turned deadly.
Yeah.
He murdered 3 women.
I mean...
Alice Martin,
It's just...
Deborah Lynn Ewing, and Mary Carell Reisinger.
It's just heartbreaking to think about.
Each of these women, their lives cut short.
Right.
It's a stark reminder of the very real human cost of these crimes.
And it wasn't just those 3 women.
No, there were 2 others.
2 other women that he attacked.
Right. And one of them,
And one of them, Kelly Gant.
Kelly Gant, she fought back with incredible courage
She did.
and ended up playing a key role in his capture.
Her story, I mean, what a powerful example of resilience.
It really is.
Despite suffering this really severe throat injury from the attack,
Yes.
she was still able to communicate with a forensic artist.
Imagine that.
So she couldn't even speak,
No.
but she managed to describe her attacker
Through writing and gesture.
through writing and gestures.
It's just incredible.
It is incredible, and that description led to a sketch
Right?
that a corrections officer actually recognized
As Daniel Lee Corwin.
as Daniel Lee Corwin. So they already had him on their radar.
They did because of his previous conviction.
Right, because of that previous conviction.
And it gets even more chilling.
It does. During his trial, Corwin confessed to another rape,
He did.
one that had gone unsolved for years.
Can you believe that?
I mean, that confession.
It adds a whole other layer of complexity to this case.
It does. It really does.
Because it wasn't just about the crimes he was currently on trial for.
Right.
It seemed like there was this pattern of behavior that had been going on for years.
Yeah.
Even going back to his early teens.
He admitted to a rape that he committed when he was only 13 or 14.
13 or 14 years old.
What could possibly lead someone down such a dark path at such a young age?
It's a question that demands a deeper look into his past.
It does.
Was it a troubled childhood? Were there warning signs that were missed?
It's hard to know.
These are all questions we're going to try to explore as we go deeper.
We know that ultimately Corwin, he did face justice for his crimes.
He did.
He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death.
That's right. And his execution took place in 1998.
1998, but even in his final moments, Corwin's story takes another turn.
Yeah, there was a final statement he offered.
Really?
A glimpse into his state of mind. He expressed remorse
Really?
for his actions, apologized to the families of his victims.
I mean, that must have been incredibly difficult for the families to hear those words,
I can't imagine.
especially after everything they'd been through.
It's hard to fathom.
What exactly did he say?
He said, I guess the first thing I want to do is thank some very special people for affording me the opportunity that y'all did. It made a real big difference in my life. I'm sorry, I regret what happened, and I want you to know that I'm sorry. I just ask and hope that sometime down the line that you can forgive me. I think in a lot of ways that without that, it becomes very empty and hollow, and the only thing we have is hatred and anger.
Those are powerful words, especially coming from someone who committed such horrific acts.
They are.
It makes you think about the possibility of redemption, even in the face of such terrible crimes.
It raises a lot of questions, doesn't it?
It does.
Could his remorse have been genuine?
Right.
Or was it just a last-ditch effort to try to find some peace before his execution?
Who knows?
It's impossible to know for sure,
Right.
but it is a reminder that even in cases like this,
Yeah.
there are shades of gray.
So we have a man who commits his first brutal crime at 16, serves what seems like a very lenient sentence, and then goes on a deadly crime spree just a few years later.
It's a lot to unpack.
He's finally brought to justice, thanks in part to the extraordinary courage of a survivor.
Absolutely.
And then he expresses remorse in his final moments.
It's a wild story.
I mean, we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of all the psychological and societal factors at play here.
No, we haven't, but you're right. This case,
There's so much more to discuss.
it raises questions about the criminal justice system, the role of mental health,
Yeah.
the very nature of evil itself.
We're going to delve into all of that and more as we continue our deep dive into the life and crimes of Daniel Lee Corwin.
Absolutely. Stay tuned.
We've been laying out the facts of this case, and
Yeah.
it's already incredibly disturbing.
is.
But I keep thinking about those questions you raised earlier about, like, why someone like Corwin does what he does.
No,
Is it
no.
nature? Is
Yeah.
it nurture?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Is it a combination of both?
Probably.
I mean, what can we learn from cases like this? Yeah. To maybe prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening again.
You know, those are the exact questions that criminologists are grappling with every single day.
I bet.
It's so tempting to just look for, like, a simple answer.
Right.
You know, one single factor that explains everything.
Right.
But human behavior,
Yeah.
especially in these really extreme cases,
Right.
it's just so incredibly complex.
Yeah.
There's rarely ever just one single cause.
So it's not as easy as saying, oh, well, he had a difficult childhood, so that explains everything.
Right. Trauma is definitely a significant risk factor.
Right.
But it's not a guarantee that someone's going to become violent.
Right.
You know, some people who go through horrific things as kids, they end up being incredibly resilient.
I was going to say some people go through really awful things.
Yeah.
And they become the most compassionate people, you know.
Absolutely.
But then other people who seem to have, you know, quote unquote, normal upbringings,
Yeah.
they can commit these terrible acts.
It's true. So where do you even begin to untangle all of that?
Exactly. How do experts even begin to, like, sort through all of that?
Well, one approach is to look at the bigger picture.
Okay.
You know, the societal context.
Okay.
Corwin's crimes happened during a really specific time in American history.
Okay.
It was a time when fear of crime was on the rise.
Okay.
And there was this big push for harsher punishments.
Sure.
This was the tough on crime era.
Gotcha.
And it shaped not only how long sentences were
Yeah.
and parole policies, but also how the public viewed crime and criminals.
So this is that whole, like, war on drugs era,
Yeah.
right? Zero tolerance, mandatory minimums, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And while those policies, you know, they were intended to protect communities and hold people accountable,
Right, of course.
they also had some unintended consequences.
Like what?
Things like mass incarceration
Right.
and a shift away from rehabilitation.
So in Corwin's case, that emphasis on punishment over rehabilitation, could that have played a role in his early release?
It's possible.
And then the tragedies that followed.
It's hard to say for sure,
It's a tough question.
but it's definitely something to think about.
It's a reminder that even when we have good intentions, those policies can still have unforeseen and really devastating outcomes.
Absolutely. But how does all of this societal context help us understand Corwin as an individual?
That's what I was going to ask. Like, how does that explain his choices?
Right. It's not about making excuses for what he did.
Right.
It's about acknowledging that individual behavior is always shaped by the environment.
Okay.
Imagine a society where we had tons of support for mental health,
Okay.
early intervention programs that could identify and address risk factors,
Right.
where the focus was on rehabilitation and reintegration instead of just punishment,
Yeah.
would someone like Corwin have ended up on a different path?
It's impossible to know.
It is, but
Yeah.
it's a question worth considering.
It is. It really is. And it kind of makes you think about that whole butterfly effect idea, like how even small changes in one area can ripple out and affect so many other things.
Absolutely. But let's zoom back in on Corwin himself.
Okay.
We've been using terms like antisocial personality disorder,
Right.
psychopathy.
Yeah.
But what do those diagnoses actually look like in a person's behavior?
Yeah. How do those things actually manifest?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated.
I bet.
We have to remember that these are clinical diagnoses.
Okay.
They're not just labels to throw around.
Right.
But in Corwin's case, there are definitely behaviors that align with these conditions.
Like what kind of behaviors?
Well, think about the way he treated his victims.
Okay.
That callous disregard,
Right.
the brutality that escalated with each crime,
Right.
the lack of remorse.
Well, at least initially, right?
Yeah, at least at first, those are all red flags
Yeah.
that suggest we need to look deeper.
But he did eventually express remorse in his final statement.
He did.
So does that change things?
That's makes this case so fascinating.
Yeah.
Could facing his own death have actually triggered genuine remorse?
It's possible.
Or was it all calculated?
Right.
A way to try and manipulate how people saw him?
Right.
We can't know for sure.
We can't.
But it's so important to consider all the possibilities.
Yeah, and that brings us back to something you mentioned earlier. The importance of forensic science.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, how did investigators use evidence to piece together what happened in this case?
Right.
And ultimately connect Corwin to these crimes?
Well, forensic science is like the ultimate puzzle solver in these situations.
Oh.
You've got all these pieces,
Okay.
fingerprints, DNA,
Yeah.
trace evidence,
Gotcha.
and you have to figure out how they all fit together to tell the story.
And in Corwin's case, it was a fingerprint, right?
Yeah.
That they found on Kelly Gant's car.
On Killigan's car.
That provided that crucial link.
It did.
It's amazing how one tiny little detail can be the key to cracking a case wide open.
It is. And that's just one example. Forensic investigators probably also looked at blood spatter patterns,
Okay.
any weapons that were used,
Right.
any other trace evidence they could find at the crime scenes,
Right.
and they documented everything so carefully,
Wow.
analyzed it all to create this really comprehensive picture of what happened.
It's like they're giving a voice to the victims.
Yeah.
Using science to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves.
That's a really powerful way to put it.
And it highlights how important this work really is.
It does. Forensic investigators aren't just dealing with data.
Right.
They're dealing with human lives, with tragedies that have shattered families.
And speaking of the victims,
Yeah.
I think it's so important to take a moment and acknowledge their stories.
Absolutely.
The lives that were cut short.
We know their names: Alice Martin, Lynn Ewing, Mary Carell Reisinger.
Each one a unique individual, a life full of, hopes and dreams,
Yeah.
loved ones left behind.
It's a reminder that behind every headline, every statistic, there are real people who have suffered unimaginable loss.
We can't forget them.
We can't.
And it's heartbreaking to think about all the ripple effects of these crimes.
I know.
The families left to grapple with the aftermath, the communities forever changed.
And the survivors like Kelly Gant
Real.
who carry the scars, both visible and invisible.
Their courage is remarkable.
It is.
But it's also a reminder that the road to healing is long.
It's trauma doesn't just disappear overnight.
And it's important to remember that this isn't just some story from the past.
Right.
The impact of these crimes.
It continues to this day.
It does. And that brings us to another complex topic.
What's that?
The death penalty.
Yeah.
Corwin was sentenced to death and executed in 1998.
He was.
But his final statement, where he acknowledged the pain on both sides of the death penalty, it really challenges us to think critically about this whole issue.
It does? What did he say?
He said it's two-sided. There's pain on both sides. And it's not an issue that people just sit there and voice off and say, well, this is a good thing or this is a bad thing.
Wow.
It's a perspective we often lose sight of, in those heated debates about capital punishment.
Yeah.
Corwin's words, they remind us that beyond all the legal arguments and philosophical debates, there are real people wrestling with these incredibly difficult decisions, with the weight of life and death on their shoulders.
It's a heavy burden.
It makes you think about the moral and ethical implications of the death penalty.
It does.
Not just for the person being executed,
Right.
but for everyone involved.
Everyone.
The judges, the juries, the families of the victims.
And the families of the condemned.
It's a burden that's almost too heavy to bear.
And it forces us to really confront our own beliefs
Yeah.
about justice,
About retribution.
about the purpose of punishment itself.
Yeah, what are we really trying to achieve?
These two questions.
This conversation has been really insightful,
Yeah.
But I gotta say, it's also left me feeling a little bit overwhelmed
I understand.
by the sheer scale of all of these problems. Like,
Yeah.
it's easy to feel kind of helpless in the face of all this darkness.
It is, but I
Yeah.
think it's also important to acknowledge, that this conversation can be really emotionally draining.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
It's easy to get caught up in the intellectual part of it,
Right.
but we can't forget the human cost of these crimes.
Yeah, the impact goes way beyond just the victims and the perpetrator.
Exactly, the ripple effects, they extend so far.
It's like that image of a stone being thrown into a pond,
Yeah.
creating all those waves that reach every corner.
Families, friends, whole communities.
Yeah.
They're all touched by the trauma of these events.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about the survivors.
No, we can't.
I mean, we talked about Kelly Gant's incredible courage
Yeah.
in helping to bring Corwin to justice.
Right.
But surviving an attack like that is just the beginning of another journey.
Absolutely. The journey of healing, processing the trauma, rebuilding a life that's been completely shattered.
And that can take years.
It can take a lifetime.
So what kind of resources are out there for survivors of violent crime?
Well, there are a lot of different options.
Yeah.
Therapy support groups,
Hmm.
advocacy organizations, even legal aid services.
But even with all of that support,
Yeah,
I mean, the scars of trauma, they can run really deep.
they do.
So what are some of those long-term effects that survivors might experience?
Trauma can show up in a lot of different ways.
Okay.
Nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, depression,
Wow.
difficulty forming relationships,
Yeah.
just this constant feeling of fear and vulnerability.
It's like an invisible wound
It is.
that never really fully heals.
That's a powerful way to put it, and it highlights how crucial empathy is in these situations.
Yeah.
Understanding that even though you might not see those wounds,
Right.
they're very real, and they can have a huge impact on a person's life.
So how do we as a society create a space for healing? How do we support survivors and help them reclaim their lives?
I think it starts with awareness,
Okay.
recognizing how common trauma is and the need for really strong support systems.
Right. We need to do more.
We need to invest in mental health resources, train first responders to be more trauma-informed,
Yeah.
create a culture where survivors feel safe coming forward and asking for help.
Absolutely. And we need to remember that healing, it's not a straight line.
Oh, there will be setbacks.
There will be challenges.
Absolutely. And it's about providing that ongoing support.
Yeah, not just right after the crime, but for as long as it takes.
Exactly.
This whole conversation, it's been incredibly insightful.
Yeah,
But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't still feeling a little overwhelmed
I get
by how big these problems are.
Yeah,
It's easy to feel kind of powerless.
I understand that feeling,
Yeah.
but I also truly believe there's always hope.
Okay.
Even in the darkest of cases, there are always glimmers of light.
Yeah, I like that.
We see it in the courage of survivors like Kelly Gant,
Right.
the dedication of law enforcement and forensic investigators,
Yeah.
the people who work tirelessly in those advocacy and support organizations.
So it's about focusing on those glimmers of light,
Exactly.
on the positive changes that can happen.
Even in the most tragic situations.
Corwin's case, I mean, as disturbing as it is,
Yeah,
it can maybe be a starting point for some deeper conversations.
I think so. Conversations about criminal justice reform, mental health awareness,
Right.
all the societal forces that lead to violence.
It's a reminder that we can't just sit around and wait for these problems to solve themselves.
No, we have to be proactive. We have to get involved in finding solutions.
Yeah, create a world where these kinds of tragedies are less likely to occur.
And that starts with each and every one of us.
It does challenging our own biases, educating ourselves about these tough issues.
Absolutely. Advocating for policies that promote justice, compassion, and healing.
Even small actions can make a difference.
They contribute to a larger movement for positive change.
And remembering that hope, it's not just a feeling.
It's a call to action.
Well said. This deep dive has been a tough one.
It has.
But an important one.
Very important.
It's challenged us to confront some really uncomfortable truth,
Yeah.
to grapple with some complex questions,
Oh, sure.
and to think about our own role in creating a more just and compassionate world.
And I hope it's inspired our listeners to keep this conversation going,
Me too.
to dig deeper into these issues and find ways to make a difference in their own communities.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the life and crimes of Daniel Lee Corwin.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll be back next time with another deep dive. But until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a brighter future.
And we'll see you then.